Tonight, we enter the world of ancient tales and legends of Greek mythology. Tuck in and prepare for a peaceful, mythical slumber. Don't worry, the screen will go dark in a few moments. Our first tale, The Adventures of Odysseus. Of all the heroes who fought at Troy, none faced a more arduous journey home than Odysseus, king of the rocky island of Ithaca. While most Greeks who survived the war returned to their kingdoms within weeks or months, Odysseus wandered the Mediterranean for 10 long years, facing monsters, enchantresses, divine wrath, and countless perils before finally reaching his homeland. Odysseus had earned both fame and infamy during the Trojan War. His cunning mind conceived the stratagem of the wooden horse that finally defeated Troy after 10 years of stalemate. Yet he had also incurred the wrath of several deities, most notably Poseidon, god of the sea, whose son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, was blinded by Odysseus during his journey home. When the Greeks sacked Troy, many committed sacrilegious acts in their victory frenzy. Ajax, the Lesser, dragged Cassandra from the temple of Athena, where she had sought sanctuary. Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, slaughtered the aged King Priam at the altar of Zeus. The Greeks as a whole failed to offer proper sacrifices of thanksgiving for their victory. These impieties ensured that many would face divine punishment on their homeward voyages. Odysseus departed from the shores of Troy with 12 ships under his command, carrying the loyal men of Ithaca who had fought alongside him for a decade. Their first stop was the land of the Cicons, allies of Troy. Odysseus and his men raided their city, killing the men and taking the women as captives, along with substantial plunder. But instead of immediately setting sail as Odysseus urged, his men lingered to feast and celebrate. This delay allowed the surviving Cicons to summon reinforcements from inland settlements. In the ensuing battle, Odysseus lost 6 men from each ship before escaping back to sea. Next, storms sent by Zeus drove the fleet off course to the land of the lotus eaters. These people subsisted on the sweet lotus fruit, which induced a dreamy forgetfulness in anyone who consumed it. Several of Odysseus's scouts ate the lotus and immediately lost all desire to return home, wishing only to remain with the lotus eaters, consuming the magical fruit. Odysseus had to physically drag these men back to the ships and bind them to the rowing benches until the effects of the lotus wore off. The fleet then came to the land of the Cyclopes, a race of lawless, one-eyed giants who lived as isolated shepherds, knowing nothing of agriculture, ships, or communal governance. Curious about these creatures, Odysseus took one ship to explore their island. They discovered a massive cave stocked with cheese and milk, with pens for sheep and goats. While his men urged immediate departure with some plunder, Odysseus insisted on waiting to see the cave's inhabitant. When the Cyclops Polyphemus returned with his flocks, he blocked the cave entrance with a massive boulder that no human could move. Discovering the Greeks, he asked who they were. Odysseus, employing the cunning for which he was famous, gave his name as Nobody. Polyphemus, showing no regard for the sacred laws of hospitality, seized 2 of Odysseus's men, smashed their heads against the cave floor, and devoured them raw. He then fell asleep, only to awake the next morning and consume 2 more men for his breakfast before leaving with his flocks, once again sealing the Greeks inside. During the day, Odysseus formulated a plan. He and his men sharpened the end of a massive wooden stake and hardened it in the fire. That evening, when Polyphemus returned and ate 2 more men, Odysseus offered him strong wine that the Greeks had brought from their ship. Unaccustomed to alcohol, the Cyclops quickly became intoxicated. When he asked Odysseus's name again, the Greek repeated that he was nobody. As Polyphemus fell into a drunken stupor, Odysseus and his men heated the stake in the coals until it glowed red hot. Then, mustering all their courage, they drove it into the Cyclops' single eye, twisting it like a drill. Polyphemus's agonized screams brought other Cyclopes to the cave entrance, but when they called out asking what was wrong, he bellowed, "Nobody is hurting me." Taking this to mean he was suffering some divine affliction rather than a human attack, the other Cyclopes departed. The next morning, blind Polyphemus removed the boulder from the cave entrance to let his sheep out, feeling each animal's back to ensure the Greeks weren't riding them. Odysseus, however, had tied his men to the undersides of the largest rams, while he himself clung to the woolliest ram's belly. Thus hidden, they escaped the cave. Once safely aboard their ship, Odysseus could not resist boasting of his triumph. He shouted his real name and homeland to Polyphemus, taunting the blinded giant. This proved to be a grave error. Polyphemus, now knowing his attacker's identity, prayed to his father Poseidon to curse Odysseus. Grant that Odysseus, son of Laertes, may never reach his home in Ithaca. Or if he is destined to see his home and family again, let him arrive late, in sore distress, on another man's ship, having lost all his companions, and let him find troubles in his household. Poseidon heard his son's prayer, and from this moment forward, the sea god's enmity would make Odysseus's journey home infinitely more difficult. The fleet next reached the island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who received them hospitably for a month. Upon their departure, Aeolus presented Odysseus with a sealed bag containing all the adverse winds, leaving only the favorable west wind free to blow them straight to Ithaca. For 9 days, they sailed, with Odysseus himself holding the helm, unwilling to entrust it to anyone else. When Ithaca finally appeared on the horizon, exhaustion overcame him and he fell asleep. His men, who had been wondering what treasure Aeolus's bag contained, seized this opportunity to open it. Immediately, all the captive winds rushed out in a terrible tempest that blew the ships back to Aeolus's island. When Odysseus explained what had happened and begged for further help, Aeolus refused, declaring that a man so obviously cursed by the gods was beyond his assistance. Sailing onward, they reached the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals. Odysseus prudently kept his own ship outside the harbor, while sending scouts in the other 11 vessels. The Laestrygonians destroyed these ships with boulders hurled from the cliffs and speared the sailors like fish. Only Odysseus's ship escaped the massacre. With his company now reduced to a single vessel, Odysseus reached the island of the enchantress Circe. Half of his remaining men, led by his second in command, Eurylochus, went to explore the island while Odysseus and the others remained with the ship. The exploring party found a palace in a forest clearing, surrounded by docile lions and wolves that had once been men. Inside, the beautiful Circe welcomed them and prepared a feast laced with magical herbs. When the men ate, she touched them with her wand, transforming all except Eurylochus, who had suspiciously waited outside, into swine, though they retained their human minds. Eurylochus fled back to the ship with the terrible news. Odysseus immediately set out alone to rescue his men. On the way, he was met by the god Hermes, who gave him a magical herb called moly that would protect him from Circe's spells. Thus protected, Odysseus drank Circe's potion without effect. When she tried to transform him with her wand, he drew his sword and threatened her. Recognizing that Odysseus was the hero whose coming had been prophesied to her, Circe restored his men to human form and became his lover. She hosted the Greeks in luxury for a year, until the men finally persuaded Odysseus that it was time to resume their journey home. Before they departed, Circe informed Odysseus that he must first consult the spirit of the blind prophet Tyreges in the underworld to learn how to appease Poseidon. She provided detailed instructions for reaching the realm of the dead and performing the necessary rituals. Following her guidance, Odysseus sailed to the western edge of the world, where perpetual night reigns. There, at the confluence of the rivers of the underworld, he dug a pit and poured libations of milk, honey, wine, and water, followed by the blood of sacrificed sheep. This blood allowed the shades of the dead to temporarily regain speech. Many spirits came forth, including Odysseus's mother Anticlea, who had died of grief during his long absence, and his former comrade Elpenor, who had fallen from Circe's roof while drunk and whose body remained unburied. Odysseus had to fend off these familiar shades until Tyreges appeared and drank from the blood offering. The prophet revealed that Poseidon's wrath would make Odysseus's journey home arduous, but not impossible. He warned that disaster would strike if Odysseus or his men harmed the cattle of the sun god Helios on the island of Thrinacia. He foretold that Odysseus would return home alone and find his house full of men courting his wife. After dealing with these suitors, Odysseus would need to make a final journey inland, carrying an oar, until he reached people who knew nothing of the sea and mistook the oar for a winnowing fan. There he should plant the oar and make sacrifices to Poseidon before returning home to live out his days in peace. After speaking with other shades, including the great heroes of the Trojan War, Odysseus returned to Circe's island. She provided additional warnings about the dangers ahead. The sirens, whose enchanting songs lured sailors to their deaths. The wandering rocks, which crushed passing ships. And the twin perils of Scylla and Charybdis, the former a six-headed monster that would snatch men from the deck. The latter a whirlpool that could swallow an entire ship. Heeding Circe's advice, Odysseus had his men plug their ears with wax when they approached the Sirens' Island. Curious to hear the legendary song himself, he had his men lash him to the mast with strict instructions not to release him no matter how much he begged. When he heard the sirens' supernaturally beautiful voices promising knowledge of all things, he strained against his bonds and ordered his men to free him, but they bound him tighter until they were safely past. Choosing to risk Scylla rather than Charybdis, Odysseus lost 6 men to the monster's 6 heads, but saved the ship and the remaining crew. They then reached the island of Thrinacia, where Helios kept his sacred cattle. Despite Tyreus's warning, Odysseus agreed to land there when his exhausted men threatened mutiny, extracting a promise that they would not harm the cattle. For a month, contrary winds prevented their departure, and their provisions ran out. While Odysseus slept, his starving men, led by Eurylochus, slaughtered some of Helios's cattle. When Odysseus awoke and discovered the sacrilege, he knew they were doomed but could do nothing to change their fate. When they finally set sail, Zeus fulfilled Helios's demand for vengeance by sending a terrible storm that destroyed the ship and drowned all the crew except Odysseus, who clung to the floating mast. The currents carried him back to Charybdis, where he narrowly escaped being sucked into the whirlpool by grabbing onto an overhanging fig tree until the mast resurfaced. Drifting for 9 days, Odysseus finally washed ashore on the island of the nymph Calypso, who fell in love with him and kept him as her captive for 7 years, offering immortality if he would stay with her forever. Though he shared her bed, Odysseus never ceased longing for his home and his wife Penelope. Finally, the goddess Athena, Odysseus's divine patron, pleaded his case before Zeus. The king of gods sent Hermes to order Calypso to release her captive. Though heartbroken, she complied, helping Odysseus build a raft and providing provisions for his journey. 18 days later, as the coast of Phaeacia, identified by some scholars as Corfu, came into view, Poseidon spotted Odysseus and unleashed a storm that destroyed the raft. The sea goddess Ino took pity on him and gave him her veil, which kept him afloat until he could swim to shore, where he collapsed from exhaustion. The next morning, he was discovered by Nausicaa, daughter of the Phaeacian king Alcinous, who had come to the beach to wash clothing. She provided him with food and clothing and directed him to her father's palace. There, after initially concealing his identity, Odysseus revealed himself and recounted his adventures since leaving Troy. Moved by his tale, the Phaeacians loaded him with gifts and transported him to Ithaca on one of their magical ships, which required neither helmsmen nor oars. Odysseus arrived in Ithaca while asleep, the Phaeacians having placed him and his treasures on the shore before departing. Athena appeared to him, disguising him as an aged beggar so he could assess the situation in his palace without being recognized. For 3 years, Penelope had been besieged by 108 suitors from the nobility of Ithaca and surrounding islands. These men had taken up residence in Odysseus's palace, consuming his wealth in endless feasting while pressuring Penelope to choose one of them as her new husband. She had held them off with a clever stratagem. She promised to choose a husband after completing a funeral shroud for Odysseus's elderly father Laertes. But each night, she secretly undid the day's weaving, thus prolonging the work indefinitely. Eventually, a disloyal servant revealed her trick, and the suitors forced her to finish the shroud. Disguised as the beggar, Odysseus first visited his faithful swineherd Eumaeus, who treated him kindly despite his apparent poverty. There he was reunited with his son Telemachus, who had just returned from a journey seeking news of his father. Athena briefly lifted Odysseus's disguise so that father and son could recognize each other, and together they planned the suitors' destruction. Odysseus entered his own palace as a beggar, enduring the abuse and mockery of the suitors. He exchanged meaningful glances with Penelope, who did not recognize him, but felt strangely drawn to the mysterious stranger. His old nurse, Eurycleia, bathing his feet, recognized him by a distinctive scar on his leg. But Odysseus silenced her before she could reveal his identity. Penelope, inspired by Athena, announced a contest. She would marry whichever man could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through a row of 12 axe heads. The suitors all tried and failed to string the bow. Then the beggar asked for his turn, despite the suitors' derision. To their astonishment, he strung the bow with ease and sent an arrow cleanly through all 12 axe heads. Immediately, Odysseus cast off his disguise, and with Telemachus, Eumaeus, and another loyal servant beside him, began to slaughter the suitors. Trapped in the hall with the doors secured, the unarmed suitors fell one by one to Odysseus's arrows, and when those were exhausted, to his spear. Not one was spared, nor were the disloyal servant women who had consorted with them. Penelope, who had been asleep during the slaughter, remained skeptical even when told that her husband had returned and killed the suitors. To test him, she ordered that their marriage bed be moved, knowing that the true Odysseus had built this bed around a living olive tree and would know it could not be moved. When Odysseus reacted with anger to this suggestion, describing in detail how he had crafted the immovable bed, Penelope finally accepted that her husband had truly returned. After 20 years of separation, Odysseus and Penelope were reunited. The next day, he visited his elderly father Laertes, who had been living in squalid retirement, grieving for his lost son. The families of the slain suitors attempted to take revenge, but Athena, taking the form of Mentor, intervened to establish peace. Thus Odysseus, having endured countless hardships and lost all his companions, finally regained his kingdom, his wife, and his place in the world. According to Tyreus's prophecy, he would make one final journey inland before living out his days in peace and prosperity, dying at a ripe old age from the sea. A prophecy fulfilled in some later traditions, when his son by Circe accidentally killed him with a spear tipped with the venomous spine of a stingray. The epic journey of Odysseus stands as one of literature's greatest adventure tales, a testament to human perseverance, cunning, and the enduring desire for home that can sustain hope through even the most daunting challenges. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the ancient world of Greek mythology. These timeless tales have traveled across thousands of years to reach your ears tonight, carrying with them the wisdom, folly, tragedy, and triumph of our ancestors. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope these stories have transported you to another world, one where gods walk among mortals. Heroes face impossible challenges, and even the most ordinary shepherd might find themselves caught up in extraordinary events. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Sleep Story channel. There are so many more tales waiting to be told, from the misty legends of the Norse gods to the sun-drenched myths of ancient Egypt, from the epic of Gilgamesh to the adventures of the Arabian Nights. I would love to see your comments down below. Which character from tonight's stories would you most like to meet? Perhaps wise Prometheus, who gave humanity the gift of fire, Or maybe clever Odysseus, whose wits helped him survive so many perils. As you drift off to sleep, may these ancient stories weave themselves into your dreams, carrying you to realms of imagination where anything is possible. Good night, sleep tight, and remember, even in the darkest night, the stars still tell their stories above us, just as they did for the ancient Greeks thousands of years ago. Cupid and Psyche. In a certain kingdom, there lived a king and queen who were blessed with 3 daughters of remarkable beauty. The 2 elder princesses, though lovely, were nothing compared to the youngest, whose name was Psyche. Her beauty was so extraordinary that people began to neglect the worship of Venus, goddess of love and beauty, choosing instead to admire and adore the mortal princess. Travelers came from distant lands just to gaze upon Psyche's face. They would kneel before her as if she were divine, leaving offerings that should have been placed on Venus's altars. The temples of the goddess stood empty while crowds gathered wherever Psyche appeared. Though Psyche herself remained modest and unassuming, never encouraging this misplaced worship, Venus was not appeased. The goddess watched from Mount Olympus as her shrines collected dust, and her power seemed to diminish in the face of a mere mortal's beauty. "Is this how they repay me?" Venus fumed to herself. "I, who have blessed countless lovers, who have filled human hearts with the greatest joy they can know, am cast aside for a transient human girl. She will age and wither as all mortals do, while my beauty remains eternal. Yet they worship her instead of me." Venus's jealousy grew until she could bear it no longer. She summoned her son, Cupid, known to the Greeks as Eros, the winged god of desire whose golden arrows could make anyone fall desperately in love with the first person they saw after being struck. "My son," Venus said, her voice sweet but her eyes cold with anger, "I have a task for you. There is a mortal princess named Psyche who has stolen the worship rightfully mine. Go to her and use your power to ensure she falls in love with the most hideous, despicable creature you can find, some monster or villain who will make her life a torment." Cupid, accustomed to obeying his mother's commands, took up his bow and quiver of arrows and flew down to earth to find this presumptuous mortal. He slipped invisibly into Psyche's bedchamber as she slept, prepared to carry out Venus's vengeful plan. But as he stood over the sleeping princess, arrow nocked and ready, Cupid was struck by her incredible beauty. Her face in repose showed such innocence and gentleness that he found himself lowering his bow. Leaning closer to examine her features in the moonlight, Cupid accidentally pricked himself with his own arrow. In that instant, he fell hopelessly in love with Psyche. Knowing that his mother's wrath would be terrible if she discovered his failure, Cupid formulated a new plan. He would ensure that Psyche remained unmarried until he could find a way for them to be together, despite his mother's jealousy. Meanwhile, Psyche's situation had grown troubling. Despite being admired by all, she remained unwed, while her less beautiful sisters had married kings from neighboring lands. No suitor asked for her hand, for all were intimidated by her seemingly divine beauty. They felt more comfortable worshiping her from afar than approaching her as a potential bride. The king, concerned for his daughter's future, consulted the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. The oracle's response was dire. Dress the maiden in funeral attire, and leave her on a rocky mountaintop. Her husband awaits her there, a fearsome winged serpent, whom neither gods nor mortals can resist. With heavy hearts, the king and queen prepared to follow the oracle's command, believing it to be the will of the gods. Psyche, though terrified, accepted her fate with dignity. "If my beauty has offended the gods," she told her weeping parents, "then I must pay the price. Perhaps this is how I am meant to serve the divine will." A mournful procession accompanied Psyche to the designated mountain. There, dressed in wedding clothes that seemed more appropriate for a funeral, she was left alone as night fell. Trembling with fear, but resolved to meet her fate bravely, Psyche waited for the monstrous husband the oracle had described. As she stood on the precipice, a gentle wind began to swirl around her. It was Zephyrus, the west wind, sent by Cupid to bring Psyche to his palace. The wind lifted her with surprising gentleness and carried her down from the mountain to a valley below, where she was set carefully upon a soft meadow before a magnificent palace. The structure before her gleamed with gold, silver, and precious gems. Its columns were carved from rare marbles, its floors inlaid with intricate mosaics depicting scenes from nature and mythology. Hesitantly, Psyche approached the entrance, where she was greeted by invisible servants. "Welcome, mistress," voices said from the empty air. "This palace is yours. We are here to serve you in all things. Refresh yourself with a bath, and then a feast awaits you." Still expecting at any moment to meet the serpent husband foretold by the oracle, Psyche allowed herself to be led by the invisible attendants. They bathed her in perfumed water, dressed her in fine silks, and guided her to a banquet hall where delicacies of every kind awaited. As she ate, unseen musicians played soothing melodies. After the feast, Psyche was led to a magnificent bedchamber. As night fell completely and the room was plunged into perfect darkness, she heard someone enter. Though she could not see him, she sensed her mysterious husband's presence. "Do not fear me, beloved Psyche," said a gentle, melodious voice. "I am not the monster you were led to expect. I am your husband, and this palace and all within it are yours to command. Only one thing I ask: do not attempt to look upon my face. If you see me, I will be forced to leave you forever." Psyche, though curious about her husband's appearance, agreed to his condition. In the darkness, she found him to be kind and loving, his conversation intelligent and charming. Night after night, he came to her only in complete darkness and left before dawn. During the days, she explored her magnificent home and enjoyed the company of the invisible servants who anticipated her every need. Yet as weeks passed, Psyche grew lonely for human companionship. When she expressed this to her husband, he reluctantly agreed that her sisters might visit, though he warned her that they could bring only trouble. "Zephyrus will bring them here," he told her, "but beware their envy and their questions. They will not understand our happiness and will seek to destroy it." The next day, Zephyrus carried Psyche's sisters down to the palace. They were astounded by its splendor and immediately consumed with jealousy when they saw how their once pitied sister now lived in greater luxury than their royal husbands could provide. "Where is your husband?" they asked, looking around suspiciously. "What manner of man possesses such wealth?" Psyche, remembering her promise, created a false description. "He is a handsome young hunter," she said, "who is away now in the mountains pursuing game." The sisters exchanged glances, clearly disbelieving her story. Before they left, they planted seeds of doubt in Psyche's mind. "Are you certain he is not the serpent the oracle foretold? Perhaps he conceals himself in darkness because his form is monstrous. He may be fattening you with delicacies before devouring you and your unborn child." Psyche had not realized she was with child, but placing a hand on her stomach, she knew her sisters spoke the truth about her condition, if nothing else. After they departed, their words continued to trouble her. What if her husband was indeed a monster? Didn't she have a right to know whom she had married, who would be the father of her child? That night, when her husband lay sleeping beside her, Psyche carefully lit an oil lamp she had hidden earlier. Holding it above him, she finally gazed upon the face of her mysterious spouse and gasped in wonder. Far from being a serpent or monster, her husband was Cupid himself, the most beautiful of the gods. His face was perfect in its divine handsomeness, his body godlike in its proportions. From his shoulders sprouted magnificent wings, their feathers as soft as silk. Beside the bed lay his bow and his quiver of arrows. As Psyche leaned closer, entranced by his beauty, a drop of hot oil fell from her lamp onto Cupid's shoulder. He awoke with a start, saw the light and Psyche's face looking down at him, and knew immediately that his secret was discovered. "Is this how you keep your promise?" he asked sadly. "Now I must leave you as I warned." "No," Psyche cried, reaching for him. "Now that I know who you are, I love you even more. Please don't go." But Cupid was already rising into the air, his wings carrying him toward an open window. "Love cannot live where there is no trust," he said. "Farewell, Psyche." In desperation, Psyche grabbed his ankle, and for a moment she was lifted from the ground. But she could not maintain her grip and fell back to earth as Cupid disappeared into the night sky. In that instant, the magnificent palace vanished around her, leaving Psyche alone in an open field, her fine clothes replaced by the simple dress she had worn before. Heartbroken and determined to find her husband again, Psyche began a long and arduous journey. She traveled to the cities where her sisters lived and told them what had happened. Rather than offering sympathy, they were excited by the news that Cupid was unattached. Separately, each sister climbed to the mountaintop where Psyche had originally been left, hoping that Zephyrus would carry them to the god of love. But the west wind did not come for them, and both fell to their deaths on the rocks below. Psyche continued her search, going from temple to temple, seeking help from the gods. Most turned her away, unwilling to interfere in what they saw as Venus's rightful domain. Finally, in desperation, Psyche decided to surrender herself directly to Venus, hoping that by humbling herself before the goddess, she might win back her husband. Venus, still burning with jealousy and now furious that her son had disobeyed her, was not inclined toward mercy when Psyche appeared at her temple. "So," she said coldly, "you wish to be my daughter-in-law. Let us see if you are worthy of my son. I have some tasks for you to perform." Thus began Psyche's trials. First, Venus led her to a storehouse filled with a vast jumble of seeds, wheat, millet, barley, lentils, beans, and more, all mixed together in a hopeless mass. "Separate these into their proper piles by nightfall," the goddess commanded, "or face my wrath." The task seemed impossible, and Psyche sat weeping before the mountain of seeds. But a column of ants, taking pity on her, marched into the storehouse and began sorting the grains, each tiny worker carrying a single seed to its appropriate pile. By sunset, the work was complete. Venus was displeased to find the task accomplished. "You had help," she accused. "Tomorrow's task will not be so easily managed by others." The second task was to collect golden wool from a flock of fierce, man-killing sheep that grazed by a river. Again, Psyche despaired, knowing she could not approach the deadly animals without being torn apart. As she sat contemplating her seemingly impossible task, a green reed on the riverbank whispered to her, "Wait until noon, when the sheep rest in the shade. Then you may gather the golden wool that has caught on the thorny bushes where they graze." Psyche followed this advice and returned to Venus with the golden wool. The goddess, even more determined to be rid of her unwanted daughter-in-law, devised a third task. She gave Psyche a crystal flask and ordered her to fill it with water from the river Styx, where it fell in a mighty waterfall from a cliff so high its top was lost in the clouds. The rocks were slippery, the drop was sheer, and the waters themselves were guarded by fearsome dragons. As Psyche stood before the waterfall, an eagle sacred bird of Jupiter swooped down, took the flask from her hands, filled it at the perilous source, and returned it to her safely. When Psyche presented the flask of Styx water to Venus, the goddess was furious that this third impossible task had been accomplished. For her final challenge, she handed Psyche a small box. "Take this to the underworld," she commanded. "Present it to Proserpina, queen of that realm, and ask her to place in it a small portion of her beauty. The journey has tired me, and I need it to restore my appearance before the evening's festivities on Olympus." This fourth task was the most dangerous of all, for no mortal could enter the underworld and return alive. Yet Psyche, still determined to win back Cupid, set out for the entrance to the realm of the dead. Along the way, a mysterious voice gave her specific instructions. Take 2 coins for the ferryman Charon, 2 barley cakes soaked in honey for the 3-headed dog Cerberus, and most importantly, do not be distracted by any of the sorrowful sights or pleading voices she would encounter in the land of the dead. Following these instructions exactly, Psyche made her way through the underworld to Proserpina's palace. The queen of the dead, perhaps moved by the young woman's courage, agreed to Venus's request and placed something in the box, which she then sealed tightly. "Remember," said the same mysterious voice as Psyche began her return journey, "do not open the box under any circumstances." But as Psyche neared the exit from the underworld, a thought occurred to her. If the box contained beauty potent enough to refresh a goddess, might not a small amount help Psyche herself appear more attractive to Cupid? Surely Venus would never notice if she used just a tiny bit. Giving in to temptation, Psyche opened the box. But instead of beauty, what Proserpina had placed inside was a sleep so profound it was akin to death. As soon as the box was opened, this magical sleep escaped and overwhelmed Psyche, who collapsed on the path, seemingly lifeless. And there she might have remained forever, had not Cupid, recovered from his wound and unable to forget his love for Psyche, gone searching for her. Finding her unconscious form, he gathered the sleep back into its box and gently woke her with the touch of one of his arrows. "Oh, Psyche," he said tenderly, "curiosity has nearly undone you again. But now I will take matters into my own hands. Cupid flew with Psyche to Mount Olympus, where he appealed directly to Jupiter, king of the gods. Moved by the young god's sincere love and impressed by Psyche's devotion and perseverance, Jupiter called an assembly of the gods. There, he formally gave his blessing to the union of Cupid and Psyche. Even Venus was reconciled when Jupiter pointed out that with Psyche made immortal and brought to Olympus, humans would return to properly worshipping the goddess of love rather than a mortal princess. To seal Psyche's immortality, Jupiter offered her a cup of ambrosia, the divine food of the gods. Upon drinking it, she was transformed, her beauty now truly divine and eternal. Her union with Cupid was celebrated with a magnificent feast attended by all the gods. In due time, Psyche gave birth to a daughter whom they named Volupta's Pleasure, the natural offspring of love and the soul, for that is what Psyche's name means in Greek, the soul. The tale of Cupid and Psyche reminds us that the path of true love is rarely smooth, that trust is essential to lasting relationships, and that sometimes we must endure great trials to prove ourselves worthy of the happiness we seek. It stands as one of the most enduring love stories from the ancient world, a testament to the belief that love, with sufficient devotion and courage, can ultimately transcend all obstacles, even the jealousy of the gods themselves. The Deluge. There was a time when the human race became so wicked that the gods determined it must be destroyed. Zeus looked down from Mount Olympus and saw that the earth was filled with violence and corruption. The humans, those creatures fashioned by Prometheus and gifted with divine fire, had turned away from righteousness. They no longer honored the gods with proper sacrifices. They broke sacred oaths, violated the laws of hospitality, and committed countless atrocities against one another. Zeus summoned the divine council and declared his intention: I will destroy these mortals whom I created. From the mountaintops to the valleys below, I will cleanse the earth of their presence. Perhaps in time, a better race might replace them. Most of the gods agreed with this harsh judgment, for they too had witnessed the depravity of humankind. But before Zeus could enact his plan, Prometheus, who still cared deeply for his creation, despite his ongoing punishment, learned of the impending destruction. Though chained to his rocky prison, the Titan managed to send a warning to his son Deucalion, the most righteous man alive. Deucalion had married Pyrrha, daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora, and together they had lived honorable lives, always showing proper reverence to the gods. They alone among mortals had remained untainted by the corruption that infected the rest of humanity. Heeding his father's warning, Deucalion built a great chest, what we might call an ark. He gathered provisions for many days, and with Pyrrha, sealed himself inside just as Zeus unleashed his fury upon the world. Zeus called upon his brother Poseidon, god of the sea, to aid in the destruction. Poseidon raised his mighty trident and struck the earth. The ground shook violently, causing the seas to surge beyond their boundaries. At the same time, Zeus opened the chambers of the sky, and rain poured down in torrents never before witnessed by human eyes. Day after day, the deluge continued. The rivers overflowed their banks and merged with the rising seas. The valleys filled with water, forcing people to flee to higher ground. But there would be no escape. Soon even the hills were submerged, and only the highest mountain peaks remained above the floodwaters. Those who had taken refuge on mountaintops watched in horror as the waters continued to rise inexorably toward them. Neighbors who had quarreled bitterly now clung to each other in terror. Enemies forgot their hatreds in the face of common doom. The wealthy and the poor, the strong and the weak, all faced the same fate as the waters claimed them one by one. The entire world became a sea without shores. All the works of humankind, the cities they had built, the fields they had cultivated, the monuments they had erected to their own glory, vanished beneath the merciless waters. Of all the teeming multitudes that had populated the earth, only Deucalion and Pyrrha remained, floating in their ark upon the endless expanse of water. For 9 days and 9 nights, their vessel was tossed upon the flood. They could only pray to the gods for mercy, not knowing if their prayers were heard or if they too were destined to perish. But on the 10th day, the rain ceased. Gradually, the waters began to recede. The ark came to rest upon the summit of Mount Parnassus, the only mountain peak that had not been completely submerged. As the waters continued to withdraw, Deucalion and Pyrrha emerged from their vessel to find themselves alone in a desolate world. The once fertile plains were now muddy wastelands. The forests had been uprooted and washed away. No bird sang, no animal called, no human voice could be heard in the eerie silence. Overwhelmed by the magnitude of the destruction and their own survival, Deucalion and Pyrrha made their way to a small shrine dedicated to Themis, goddess of divine law and order, which had somehow survived atop the mountain. There they fell to their knees and prayed fervently. "O divine Themis," they pleaded, "tell us how we, the last of the human race, might repopulate this empty world. Grant us the wisdom to begin anew and to avoid the errors that led to such terrible punishment." Their sincere prayer reached the goddess, who appeared before them in a luminous form. "Cover your heads," she instructed. "Loosen your garments and cast behind you the bones of your great mother." After the goddess vanished, Deucalion and Pyrrha remained kneeling, puzzled by her cryptic command. What could she mean? Pyrrha wondered aloud. I could never dishonor my mother by disturbing her bones. Deucalion pondered the oracle's words carefully. Perhaps, he said after a long silence, our great mother is not your birth mother, but the earth herself, from whose substance all life comes. And her bones, might they be the stones of the earth? Pyrrha considered this interpretation and agreed it must be what Themis intended. Together, they gathered stones from the mountainside. With heads covered and garments loosened as instructed, they began to cast the stones over their shoulders without looking back. A miracle unfolded behind them. The stones thrown by Deucalion transformed into men, while those cast by Pyrrha became women. The harder stones formed bones, the softer ones became flesh, and the veins in the rock became human blood vessels. In this way, a new race of humans was created from the very substance of the earth. These stone-born people were hardier than those who had perished in the flood. They were accustomed to labor and suffering from their very origin, for they had been formed from the enduring stones that had withstood the great deluge. They spread across the empty lands, built new settlements, and began the long process of reclaiming the world for human habitation. Deucalion and Pyrrha had several children of their own, born in the natural way. Their firstborn son, Hellen, became the ancestor of all Hellenes, what we now call the Greeks. Other children and grandchildren founded various tribes and nations that would populate the renewed earth. As the years passed and the new human race multiplied, the memory of the Great Flood remained as a solemn warning. Temples were built where survivors had first set foot on dry land, and annual ceremonies commemorated both the terrible destruction and the miraculous renewal that followed. Zeus, observing from Olympus, was satisfied with this new beginning. He decreed that never again would he destroy the entire human race with a flood. As a sign of this covenant, Iris, goddess of the rainbow, would stretch her colorful arch across the sky after rainstorms, a divine promise that the waters would remain within their proper boundaries. The story of Deucalion and Pyrrha reminds us that even in the face of divine punishment, hope remains. From the most complete destruction can come renewal, and from the hardest stone can emerge the resilient human spirit. It stands as testimony to the Greeks' belief that humanity, despite its flaws, possesses the capacity for righteousness and rebirth. The House of Agamemnon. The fall of Troy marked not the end, but merely the beginning of another tragic cycle, the blood-soaked saga of the House of Atreus, particularly the family of Agamemnon. This tale of murder, revenge, madness, and eventual redemption stands as one of the most powerful family tragedies ever recorded. The curse on the House of Atreus began generations before the Trojan War, when Tantalus, a son of Zeus who had been honored by dining with the gods, committed an unthinkable crime. To test the gods' omniscience, he killed his own son Pelops, cooked the body, and served it at a divine banquet. The gods, recognizing the abominable dish, refused to eat all except Demeter, who, distracted by grief over her missing daughter Persephone, consumed a shoulder portion before realizing what she had done. The gods restored Pelops to life, replacing his eaten shoulder with one of ivory, and condemned Tantalus to eternal punishment in the underworld. There he stands in a pool of water beneath fruit-laden branches, both of which recede whenever he reaches for them, leaving him perpetually tantalized by what he cannot have. Moreover, a great stone hangs over his head, threatening to crush him at any moment. Pelops grew to manhood and sought to marry Hippodamia, daughter of King Oenomaus. The king, who either loved his daughter too possessively or feared a prophecy that his son-in-law would kill him, challenged each suitor to a chariot race. Oenomaus had divinely gifted horses and had already killed 18 young men who had failed the test. Pelops bribed the king's charioteer, Myrtilus, to sabotage the royal chariot by replacing the linchpins with wax ones. During the race, the wax melted, the wheels flew off, and Oenomaus was dragged to death. Instead of rewarding Myrtilus as promised, Pelops threw him into the sea to drown. With his dying breath, Myrtilus cursed Pelops and all his descendants. This curse would manifest through generations of the House of Atreus, with family members murdering one another in an unending cycle of violence and retribution. Pelops had 2 sons, Atreus and Thyestes, who became bitter rivals. When Thyestes seduced Atreus's wife, Arope, Atreus swore revenge. Pretending reconciliation, He invited Theists to a banquet where he served him the cooked flesh of Theists' own sons. When Theists realized what he had consumed, he cursed Atreus' line and fled with his one surviving son, Aegisthus. Atreus' sons were Agamemnon and Menelaus, who married sisters Clytemnestra and Helen, respectively. When Paris of Troy abducted Helen, precipitating the Trojan War, Agamemnon took command of the Greek forces. But as we have seen, the fleet was stranded at Aulis by contrary winds, and the prophet Calchas declared that Agamemnon must sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia to appease the goddess Artemis. Agamemnon lured Iphigenia to Aulis with the false promise of marriage to Achilles. Some versions of the myth say that at the last moment, Artemis substituted a deer on the altar and spirited Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess in the distant land of Taurus. Others maintain that Iphigenia died under her father's knife. Either way, Clytemnestra never forgave her husband for this betrayal. During Agamemnon's 10-year absence at Troy, Clytemnestra took Theists' son Aegisthus as her lover. Together they plotted revenge against Agamemnon for the sacrifice of Iphigenia. They also established a system of beacons stretching from Troy to Mycenae, ensuring they would know immediately when the city fell. When Troy was finally conquered, Agamemnon took as his prize the Trojan princess Cassandra, daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba. Apollo had gifted Cassandra with the power of prophecy, but when she rejected his advances, cursed her so that no one would believe her predictions. As Agamemnon's ship approached Mycenae, Cassandra foresaw the murder awaiting them, but could not convince anyone of the danger. Clytemnestra welcomed her husband with false joy, inviting him to walk on expensive purple tapestries, an act of hubris that tempted divine wrath. She then prepared a bath for him, and as he emerged unarmed and entangled in a cloth robe, struck him down with an axe. In some accounts, Aegisthus assisted in the murder. In others, Clytemnestra acted alone. Afterward, they killed Cassandra as well. Clytemnestra justified the murder publicly as vengeance for Iphigenia's sacrifice. She and Aegisthus then ruled Mycenae, living in fear of Agamemnon's children Electra, Chrysothemis, and Orsts. Electra managed to smuggle her young brother Orsts out of Mycenae, sending him to grow up safely in Phasis under the protection of King Strophius, whose son Pylades would become Orsts' closest friend. Electra remained in Mycenae, treated as a servant rather than a princess, keeping alive the memory of her father and nurturing thoughts of revenge. She refused to accept Clytemnestra and Aegisthus as legitimate rulers, and constantly reminded the people of Mycenae of her mother's treachery. Years passed. Orsts grew to manhood in Phasis, while Electra endured humiliation and hardship in her own home. Finally, Orsts consulted the oracle at Delphi about his family situation. Apollo's command was clear. Orsts must avenge his father's murder by killing both Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. If he failed in this duty, he would face the wrath of the Furies, ancient goddesses who punished crimes against blood, relatives, particularly the killing of parents. Yet paradoxically, by following Apollo's command to kill his mother, he would also incur the Furies' vengeance. Accompanied by his loyal friend Pylades, Orsts returned to Mycenae in disguise. He brought false news of his own death, knowing this would lower Clytemnestra and Aegisthus's guard. Recognized by Electra in some versions, because of a lock of hair he left on their father's tomb, in others by a scar or piece of weaving brother and sister joyfully reunited and planned their revenge. Orsts first killed Aegisthus, who was away from the palace. Then, despite her pleas and the baring of the breast that had nursed him as an infant, he slew his mother Clytemnestra. The matricide fulfilled Apollo's command, but immediately brought down upon Orsts the wrath of the Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance who punished crimes against blood relatives. Visible only to him, the terrifying Furies pursued Orsts relentlessly, driving him to madness with their constant torment. Their hair was intertwined with snakes, blood dripped from their eyes, and they carried whips and torches. They allowed him neither rest nor peace, constantly reminding him of his terrible crime. Seeking relief, Orsts again consulted the oracle at Delphi. Apollo advised him to go to Athens and seek the protection of Athena. Following this guidance, Orsts made his way to Athens, still pursued by the vengeful Furies. In Athens, Athena established the first homicide court on the Areopagus hill to try Orsts's case. The Furies served as prosecutors, while Apollo himself defended Orsts, arguing that he had acted under divine command and that the murder of a father, Agamemnon, by a mother, Clytemnestra, was the greater crime, as mothers are merely the vessels for children whose true parentage comes from the father. The jury of Athenian citizens was evenly divided, and Athena cast the deciding vote in favor of Orsts. This established the principle that, in cases of equal votes, the defendant should be acquitted, a practice known as the vote of Athena that continued in Athenian legal procedure for centuries. Though acquitted, Orsts was not yet free of divine pursuit. The Furies, outraged at this overturning of ancient law, threatened to bring infertility and plague to Athens. Athena skillfully persuaded them to accept a new role as the Eumenides, or kindly ones, honored goddesses who would bless the city rather than curse it. They would still punish wrongdoing, but would also reward justice and proper behavior. Orsts was instructed to travel to the land of Taurus, modern Crimea, and bring back a statue of Artemis to complete his purification. In Taurus, where shipwrecked strangers were sacrificed to Artemis, Orsts discovered that the priestess who would have killed him was none other than his sister Iphigenia, who had not died at Ollys after all. Brother and sister recognized each other, and with the help of Athena, they escaped Taurus with the sacred statue, bringing it back to Greece. Finally, purified of his crime, Orsts returned to Mycenae and took his rightful place as king. He married Hermione, daughter of Menelaus and Helen, uniting the two branches of the house of Atreus. Some accounts say he also ruled Sparta after Menelaus's death. He died of a snake bite at an advanced age, having lived long enough to see the curse of his house finally lifted. The story of the House of Agamemnon, with its complex interweaving of crime, punishment, divine command, and human suffering, became the subject of great dramatic works by all three of the major Athenian tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Aeschylus's trilogy, the Oresteia, remains one of the towering achievements of world literature, tracing the evolution from primitive blood vengeance to civilized justice under law. The tale resonates across the centuries because it grapples with fundamental human questions. How do we balance justice with mercy? Can violence ever truly end violence? What happens when divine commands conflict with human morality? What are the limits of family loyalty? These questions, first explored in the blood-soaked saga of the House of Atreus, continue to challenge and fascinate us today. Icarus and Daedalus. In ancient Athens, there lived a man of extraordinary genius named Daedalus. He was an architect, sculptor, and inventor, whose creations were so lifelike that legends claimed his statues needed to be tethered, lest they walk away. His mind conceived wonders that ordinary mortals could scarcely imagine, and his hands possessed the skill to bring these visions into reality. Daedalus's talents brought him great renown throughout Greece, and eventually his fame reached the island of Crete, where King Minos ruled. The king summoned Daedalus to his court and commissioned him to build a vast labyrinth to house the Minotaur, a fearsome creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. Born from the unnatural union of Minos's wife Pasiphae and a sacred white bull, the labyrinth that Daedalus designed was a marvel of engineering, a maze so intricate and confusing that anyone who entered would become hopelessly lost, unable to find their way out again. Even Daedalus himself could barely navigate its twisting passages. This suited King Minos perfectly, for the Minotaur was both his shame and his instrument of terror. Each year, 7 young men and 7 young women from Athens were sent as tribute to Crete, where they were forced into the labyrinth to be devoured by the monster. For many years, Daedalus lived at the court of King Minos with his young son Icarus. Though they enjoyed the king's patronage and lived in comfort, they were not free to leave the island. Minos knew that Daedalus alone understood the secret of the labyrinth, and feared that, if the inventor returned to Athens, he might reveal how to navigate the maze and defeat the Minotaur. The final break came when the Athenian hero Theseus arrived among the sacrificial victims, and, with the secret help of Minos's daughter Ariadne and the guidance of Daedalus, managed to slay the Minotaur and escape the labyrinth. Enraged at this defeat, King Minos imprisoned Daedalus and Icarus in a high tower by the sea. Daedalus gazed out from their prison at the vast expanse of water surrounding Crete. Ships were carefully watched, and no vessel would carry them without the king's permission. The land routes were guarded as well. Minos controls the land and sea, Daedalus mused, but he does not control the air. That shall be our path to freedom. Day after day, as Icarus watched in wonder, Daedalus collected the feathers of seabirds that nested on the tower gulls, eagles, hawks, and falcons. He arranged these feathers from largest to smallest and bound them together with wax and thread. Gradually, 2 pairs of enormous wings took shape, one large enough for himself and a smaller pair for Icarus. When the wings were complete, Daedalus fastened the larger pair to his own shoulders and tested them cautiously, rising a few feet from the floor of their prison and hovering before settling back down. Satisfied that his invention worked, he began to instruct his son in their use. "Tomorrow we will fly from this island to freedom," he told Icarus, whose young face shone with excitement. "But listen carefully to my instructions, for our lives depend on it. When we fly, you must follow me closely. Do not fly too low, or the sea spray will dampen your wings and weigh you down. But most importantly, do not fly too high. If you approach the sun, its heat will melt the wax that holds your feathers, and you will fall. Stay the middle course, and we will reach safety." Icarus nodded solemnly, but his eyes were already on the sky, imagining the freedom of soaring like a bird above the constraints that had limited his young life. At dawn the next day, Daedalus fastened the wings to his son's arms, checking and double-checking every binding. With tears in his eyes, he embraced Icarus one last time as father and son stood on solid ground. "Remember what I told you," he said. "Not too low, not too high. Follow me and do not stray." With that, Daedalus leaped from the tower window, his great wings catching the morning air. For a heart-stopping moment he dropped, but then he found the rhythm of flight, moving his arms in powerful strokes as he had observed the birds do. He circled back to the tower where Icarus stood watching in awe. "Come," Daedalus called. Icarus took a deep breath and jumped. His smaller wings caught the air, and suddenly he was flying, truly flying, beside his father. The sensation was beyond anything he had imagined, the wind rushing past his face, the incredible lightness of his body, the panorama of the island and sea spreading out below him. Together, father and son flew away from the tower, over the palace of King Minos, where guards stood dumbfounded at the sight, and toward the sea that surrounded Crete. Below them, fishermen in their boats looked up from their nets, believing for a moment that the gods themselves were passing overhead. At first, Icarus obeyed his father's instructions perfectly, staying just behind Daedalus and maintaining a steady height above the waves. But as the exhilaration of flight filled his young heart, caution began to fade. The sky above called to him, so vast, so blue, so limitless. What would it be like to fly higher, to approach the realm of the gods, to look down on the world from an even greater height? Gradually, almost unconsciously, Icarus began to climb. His wings carried him higher and higher, away from his father, who was focused on the distant coastline that would mark their freedom. The air grew thinner, the wind colder, but Icarus barely noticed. He was intoxicated with the sheer joy of flight and the ever-expanding view. Daedalus, sensing a change in the air currents around him, looked back to check on his son. With horror, he saw Icarus far above him, still climbing toward the blazing sun. "Icarus," he cried out, "come down. Remember what I told you." But his voice was lost in the wind, and Icarus continued his ascent, reveling in his newfound power. He flew higher than the highest birds, higher than any mortal had ever been, approaching the fiery chariot of Helios himself. Then disaster struck. The heat of the sun began to soften the wax that held Icarus's wings together. At first, just a few feathers loosened and floated away, unnoticed by the boy in his euphoria. But soon entire sections of the wings began to disintegrate. Suddenly, Icarus was no longer flying but falling, his arms flapping uselessly as feathers scattered around him like snow. The terrible realization came to him all at once. He had flown too high, just as his father had warned. Now the sea that had seemed so far below was rushing up to meet him with frightening speed. His joyful shouts turned to screams of terror. Daedalus, hearing his son's cries, looked up just in time to see Icarus plummeting toward the sea, wingless and helpless. "Icarus," he screamed, changing direction and desperately trying to reach his falling son. But he was too far away, and Icarus was falling too quickly. With a final cry, Icarus struck the surface of the sea and disappeared beneath the waves. Daedalus circled the spot, calling his son's name until his voice gave out, but there was no answer. Only a few feathers floating on the water marked where Icarus had fallen. Grief-stricken, Daedalus continued his flight to the nearest land, the island of Sicily. There, broken in spirit though safe in body, he built a temple to Apollo and hung up his wings as an offering, swearing never to fly again. The part of the Mediterranean where Icarus fell became known as the Icarian Sea, a lasting memorial to the boy who flew too close to the sun. King Minos, determined to recapture Daedalus, searched throughout the Mediterranean. He would carry a spiral seashell to each kingdom he visited and offer a great reward to anyone who could pass a thread through its intricate chambers, knowing that only Daedalus would have the ingenuity to solve such a puzzle. When he reached Sicily and presented this challenge, Daedalus, working in secret, tied a thread to an ant, placed a drop of honey at the other end of the shell, and let the ant navigate the spiral. When the king saw the solved puzzle, he knew Daedalus was near. But before Minos could seize him, the daughters of Deucalion, king of Sicily, who had grown fond of the inventor, killed Minos by pouring boiling water over him while he bathed. Thus ended the pursuit, and Daedalus lived out his days in Sicily, continuing to create wondrous inventions, though none brought him the joy he had once known as a father. The tale of Icarus and Daedalus has echoed through the centuries as a powerful warning about the dangers of hubris and the failure to heed wise counsel. Yet it also celebrates the human desire to transcend limitations, to venture into unknown realms, and to literally rise above our earthbound nature, even when such ambitions carry terrible risks. Niobe. In the ancient city of Thebes, there once lived a queen named Niobe who was blessed with extraordinary beauty and noble birth. She was the daughter of Tantalus, a son of Zeus himself, and had married Amphion, king of Thebes. Amphion was renowned for his musical abilities. It was said that, when he played his lyre, the stones of Thebes' walls moved into place of their own accord, enchanted by his melodies. Together, Amphion and Niobe ruled their kingdom in prosperity and were blessed with numerous children. And it was these children who became Niobe's greatest pride and ultimately the source of her downfall. For Niobe had 14 children, 7 sons, and 7 daughters, all of them healthy, beautiful, and strong. In Greek accounts, they were called the Niobids. Niobe's children were indeed worthy of admiration. Her sons were skilled in the manly arts of hunting and warfare, while her daughters possessed grace and beauty that turned the heads of princes from neighboring kingdoms. As they grew, Niobe watched them with increasing pride, seeing in each child a reflection of her own greatness and divine ancestry. In those days, the people of Thebes, like all Greek cities, paid homage to the gods through various festivals and sacrifices. One such celebration honored Leto, mother of the divine twins Apollo and Artemis. Leto had been one of Zeus's lovers, and though she had borne him only 2 children, these offspring were among the most powerful of the Olympian gods. Apollo, god of music, prophecy, healing, and archery, drove the sun chariot across the sky each day. His twin sister Artemis was goddess of the hunt, the moon, and protector of young women. As the women of Thebes prepared for Leto's festival, draping garlands around her altars and preparing sacrificial offerings, Queen Niobe observed their devotions with growing disdain. Standing on the palace steps, adorned in royal finery with her 14 children arranged around her, she called out to the worshippers. "What foolishness is this?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the public square. "Why do you honor Leto, who has only 2 children, while I, with 14, receive no such worship? Consider who I am, daughter of Tantalus, granddaughter of Zeus, queen of this great city whose walls my husband raised with music. Look upon my beauty, which has not faded despite bearing twice 7 children. Am I not more worthy of your adoration than Leto?" The women of Thebes trembled at these words, knowing well the danger of such hubris. Quietly, they continued their preparations, but with less enthusiasm, fearful of being associated with either offense, neglecting their queen, or insulting a goddess. Niobe, however, was not satisfied with merely interrupting the ceremony. She continued her boastful speech. "Leto had but 2 children, while I have 7 times 2. Even if some misfortune should befall some of my children, I would still have more than she. What right has she to altars that I do not deserve? Remove those laurel wreaths from your hair. Discontinue these rituals and return to your homes." Intimidated by their queen's command and her royal authority, the women of Thebes left their offerings unfinished and departed, though many whispered prayers to Leto, begging forgiveness for the interruption. High on Mount Olympus, Leto heard these insults against her honor. Deeply wounded by Niobe's pride and disrespect, she sought out her divine children. Finding them on the sacred island of Deluge, where they had been born, she related Niobe's boastful words. "My children," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I who was honored to bear you, the 2 most glorious of immortals, am now mocked and deemed unworthy of devotion by a mortal woman. Unless you defend my honor, I shall believe myself truly undeserving of worship." Apollo and Artemis, devoted to their mother and quick to anger when she was slighted, immediately took up their bows. With quivers full of arrows on their backs, they wrapped themselves in clouds and descended swiftly to Thebes. Near the walls of the city was a flat, open plain where the young princes of Thebes practiced horsemanship and martial exercises. Here, Niobe's 7 sons were engaged in their daily training, some wrestling, others racing chariots, and the eldest practicing with spear and shield. Suddenly, from within the concealing clouds came a sharp, twanging sound. The eldest prince, in the midst of guiding his horses around the track, clutched his chest and fell from his chariot. An arrow had pierced his heart with unerring accuracy. "Help!" cried one of his brothers, rushing toward the fallen prince. But before he could reach him, another arrow found its mark, and he too collapsed to the ground. Confusion and panic spread among the remaining brothers. They looked around wildly for the source of the attack, but the divine archers remained hidden in their shroud of clouds. One by one, Apollo's arrows claimed the lives of Niobe's sons. Some tried to flee, others to shield their younger brothers with their own bodies. But against the gods' divine aim and invisible assault, they had no defense. The youngest son, barely more than a boy, saw all his brothers fall. He raised his arms to the heavens, not knowing that his plea was directed toward the very source of destruction. "Whoever you are," he cried, "spare me, the last and least of my mother's sons." But even as the words left his lips, an arrow found his throat, and he joined his brothers in death. Word of the tragedy spread quickly through Thebes. When Amphion, the king, heard that all his sons had been mysteriously slain, the shock and grief were too much for his heart to bear. Some accounts say he took his own life with a sword, unable to face a future without his heirs. Niobe, upon hearing the terrible news, rushed to the plain outside the city. There she found the bodies of her 7 sons laid out side by side, already being prepared for funeral rites by the citizens of Thebes. The proud queen, who had boasted only hours before, now fell to her knees in anguish, touching each cold face, closing each pair of sightless eyes. Yet even in the depths of her grief, a spark of defiance remained. Rising to her feet, her face streaked with tears, she cried out to the heavens, "Rejoice now, cruel Leto, feed on my anguish. But even with 7 children gone, I am still richer than you with your paltry 2. My victory stands." These words had barely left her lips when new cries of alarm came from the royal palace. Niobe's 7 daughters had been gathered there, dressed in black mourning clothes for their brothers, comforting one another in their shared grief. Artemis, hearing Niobe's continued defiance, had directed her divine arrows through the windows of the palace. In rapid succession, the princesses fell, each pierced through the heart by the unerring aim of the goddess of the hunt. Only the youngest daughter remained, and as with the youngest son, she pleaded for mercy. Niobe, who had rushed back to the palace upon hearing new cries of distress, flung herself over her last living child, using her own body as a shield. "Leave me just this one," she begged, all pride forgotten. "Smallest of all, leave me just this one child." But even as she made her plea, the final arrow found its mark. The last of Niobe's 14 children died in her arms. Surrounded by the bodies of her children, having lost her husband as well, Niobe was utterly alone. The citizens of Thebes, fearful of further divine wrath, kept their distance. No one dared approach the queen who had offended the gods so grievously. For 3 days and nights, the bodies of Niobe's children remained unburied, for the gods had turned the Thebans to stone with fear. On the 10th day, the gods themselves took pity and buried the children. As for Niobe, she neither ate nor drank nor spoke. Immobile with grief, she sat among her dead, her mind unable to process the magnitude of her loss. Gradually, her skin paled and hardened. Her tears, which flowed unceasingly, carved channels down her cheeks. Slowly, inexorably, Niobe herself turned to stone. The gods then sent a whirlwind that carried the stone figure of Niobe away from Thebes, across the sea to Mount Sipylus in Lydia, her homeland. There, transformed into a rock formation on the mountainside, Niobe continues to weep to this day. Travelers in ancient times reported seeing the stone figure of a woman on the mountain, with streams of water flowing down its face like endless tears. The story of Niobe became a powerful cautionary tale throughout the ancient world, a warning against the sin of hubris, excessive pride, and arrogance, especially when it led to comparing oneself favorably to the gods. Parents would tell their children of Niobe's fate to teach them humility and proper reverence for the divine powers that govern their world. In later years, poets and playwrights returned to this tragic tale repeatedly, drawn to its powerful themes of pride, divine retribution, and overwhelming grief. The image of Niobe, frozen in eternal mourning, became a potent symbol of sorrow too great for human expression. Transformed instead into something elemental and enduring grief made stone, yet still weeping without end. Have you ever wondered what happens when gods and mortals collide in a world where mountains whisper ancient secrets and the sea holds memories older than time itself? Well, you're about to find out, or fall asleep trying. Hello there, Nicole here, and welcome to the Sleep Story channel, where we turn fascinating history into your personal lullaby. Tonight, we're diving into the enchanting realm of old Greek folk stories, those timeless tales that have survived thousands of years to reach your drowsy ears. Did you know that these stories were first passed down through oral tradition long before they were ever written down? Or that they've influenced everything from modern psychology to the names of the stars in our night sky? I promise you'll be drifting into dreamland soon, wrapped in the comfort of ancient myths and legends. But while you're still awake, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. Your support helps me continue bringing these sleepy stories to fellow insomniacs around the world. And please, if you manage to stay awake long enough, leave a comment down below telling me which mythological character you'd most like to have dinner with. Personally, I'd avoid Dionysus. That party would never end. Now, let's begin our journey into the world of Greek mythology, where gods walk among mortals and heroes face impossible challenges. Orpheus and Eurydice. In the lush valleys of Thrace, where the Hebrus River winds its way through verdant hills, there once lived a musician whose melodies could charm the very stones from the mountainside. His name was Orpheus, son of the muse Calliope and either Apollo or the Thracian king Oeagrus, depending on which ancient account one believes. From his divine parentage, Orpheus inherited a gift for music that surpassed all mortal ability. When he played his lyre and raised his voice in song, the natural world itself would pause to listen. Wild beasts would forget their hunger and savagery, lying peacefully at his feet. Trees would uproot themselves to draw nearer to the enchanting sounds. Rivers would alter their courses to linger within earshot of his melodies. Even the hearts of the most hardened warriors would soften at the beauty of his music. Orpheus traveled with the Argonauts on their quest for the Golden Fleece, where his music proved invaluable. When the oarsmen grew weary, his songs renewed their strength. When the dangerous sirens attempted to lure the ship to destruction with their own enchanting voices, Orpheus played so beautifully that the sailors were deaf to the siren's call. Through many adventures, his music protected and inspired his companions. Upon returning to his homeland, Orpheus met and fell deeply in love with a wood nymph named Eurydice. Her beauty was matched only by her gentleness, and soon they were married in a joyous celebration. The trees themselves seemed to bend to create a natural cathedral for their wedding, and the birds sang accompaniment to Orpheus's bridal songs. It seemed that the greatest musician in the world had found his perfect harmony in Eurydice. Their happiness, however, was tragically brief. Shortly after their wedding, as Eurydice was walking through a meadow with her bridesmaids, she stepped upon a venomous serpent hidden in the tall grass. The snake, disturbed and defensive, sank its fangs into her foot. Despite all efforts to save her, the poison quickly spread through her body. As Orpheus rushed to her side, he could only watch helplessly as the light faded from her eyes. With her final breath, she whispered his name, and then she was gone. Orpheus's grief was beyond measure. The man whose music had brought joy to all who heard it now played only the most heart-rending laments. Day and night, he wandered the hills and valleys, his songs of sorrow causing even the rocks and wild animals to weep in sympathy. But no amount of mourning could bring Eurydice back to him. Finally, driven by unbearable longing and emboldened by his divine heritage, Orpheus made a decision that no ordinary mortal would dare contemplate. He would journey to the underworld and attempt to reclaim his bride from death itself. The entrance to the realm of Hades lay at Taenarus, a cave so deep and dark that few had ever ventured into its depths and returned to tell the tale. With his lyre strapped to his back and determination in his heart, Orpheus descended into the darkness. The path led him past spectral forms and shadowy landscapes, ever downward toward the kingdom of the dead. At the river Styx, the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, he encountered the ferryman Charon, who transported souls across the dark waters. Normally, Charon would accept only the dead, and only those properly buried with a coin placed under their tongue as payment for passage. But when Orpheus played his lyre, the ancient ferryman was so moved that he agreed to carry the living musician across the river. Next, Orpheus faced the monstrous guardian of the underworld, Cerberus, the three-headed dog whose savage growls struck terror into the hearts of the dead. Yet as the first notes from Orpheus's lyre reached the beast's 6 ears, the growls subsided. The massive heads lowered one by one, and soon the fearsome guardian lay sleeping, allowing Orpheus to pass unharmed. Through the fields of asphodel, where ordinary souls wandered as mere shadows of their former selves, Orpheus continued his journey. His music momentarily awakened these shades from their listless existence, bringing flickers of memory and emotion to their hollow eyes as he passed. At last, Orpheus reached the obsidian palace, where Hades and his queen Persephone ruled over the realm of the dead. Standing before their thrones, he bowed respectfully and began to play. The music that flowed from his fingers and voice was unlike any he had ever created before it contained all the love he felt for Eurydice, all the pain of their separation, all the longing for her return. It spoke of the brevity of life and the cruelty of fate that had taken her so young. As the final notes faded into the stillness of the underworld, something unprecedented occurred. Hades, the implacable lord of the dead, who had never shown mercy, was weeping. Beside him, Persephone's tears flowed freely down her pale cheeks. The Furies, those merciless avenging spirits, found their hard hearts softened. Throughout the vast realm, all activity ceased as souls and spirits alike were transfixed by the power of Orpheus's plea. "Never," said Hades when he could finally speak, "in all the long ages of my rule, has any living mortal moved me as you have today. Your music has accomplished what I thought impossible. It has touched death itself with the beauty of life and love." Persephone leaned toward her husband and whispered in his ear. Hades nodded slowly, then turned his gaze back to Orpheus. "We will grant what you seek, musician. Eurydice may return with you to the world above, but there is one condition." Hades's voice grew stern. "As you lead her from this realm, she must follow behind you. You must not look back at her until both of you have reached the upper world and the light of the sun falls upon your faces. One backward glance before that moment, and she will be lost to you forever. Do you accept these terms?" Without hesitation, Orpheus agreed. What was such a simple condition compared to the miracle of Eurydice's return? Hades summoned Eurydice from among the shades. When she appeared, Orpheus nearly cried out with joy, but restrained himself from rushing to embrace her, mindful of the condition. "Lead on," commanded Hades. "Remember my warning." The journey back seemed both endless and too swift. Orpheus walked ahead, playing gentle melodies to guide Eurydice's steps. Though he longed desperately to look upon her face, to assure himself that she was truly following, he kept his eyes fixed forward. They passed Cerberus, still slumbering under the lingering spell of Orpheus's music. They crossed the Styx, with Charon watching them solemnly from his ferry. They began the long ascent through winding passages that would lead them back to the world of the living. As they neared the exit, Orpheus could see daylight filtering into the cave. Just a few more steps, and they would emerge into the sunlight, fulfilling Hades's condition. But in that moment, a terrible doubt seized him. What if Hades had tricked him? What if he was leading no one from the underworld? What if Eurydice had been unable to keep up with him in her weakened, shade-like state? Just as they reached the threshold between darkness and light, Orpheus's resolve faltered. Forgetting the warning in his anxiety and love, he turned to look at Eurydice. For one joyous instant, their eyes met. She was there, almost solid, almost restored to life. But even as Orpheus reached for her, he realized his fatal mistake. With an expression of infinite sadness and love, Eurydice whispered, "Farewell, this time forever." Her form grew transparent, fading like morning mist under the sun's rays. Orpheus lunged forward, trying to embrace her, but his arms closed on empty air. She was gone, drawn back to the depths of the underworld by his broken promise. "Eurydice! Eurydice!" His anguished cries echoed through the cave, but there was no answer except the hollow repetition of her name. Orpheus tried to return to the underworld, but this time the way was barred to him. Charon refused to ferry him across the Styx again. His pleas went unheard by the gods below. His one chance had been squandered by a moment's doubt. Inconsolable, Orpheus wandered the mountains of Thrace. He spurned the company of all women, despite many who were drawn to his music and beauty. Some accounts say he turned instead to the love of young men, introducing such relationships to the Thracian people. His music, once capable of bringing joy and wonder, now expressed only his eternal grief. For 3 years, he lived as one already dead, his body present in the world of the living while his heart remained lost in the underworld with Eurydice. The end came when Orpheus encountered a group of Maenads, the wild female followers of Dionysus, in the midst of their ecstatic rituals. Enraged by his rejection of all womankind, or perhaps offended by his failure to honor Dionysus in his songs, the frenzied women fell upon him. They tore his body limb from limb and cast his head and lyre into the river Hebrus. Even in death, the connection between the musician and his instrument remained. As his head floated down the river, his lips still formed Eurydice's name, and the strings of his lyre, touched by the current, gave forth mournful sounds. The Muses gathered up his remains and buried them at the foot of Mount Olympus, where it is said that the nightingales sing more sweetly than anywhere else in the world. The soul of Orpheus descended once more to the underworld, but this time as one of the dead. There, at last, he was reunited with his beloved Eurydice. Some versions of the tale say that they walk together now in the Elysian fields, that blessed realm reserved for heroes, and those beloved by the gods, where Orpheus plays his lyre for all eternity and Eurydice dances to his music, their love transcending even the finality of death. Prometheus. In the beginning, there was only chaos. Then out of the void appeared earth, and from earth came the starry heaven. The first gods were born of these elements, and from them came a race known as the Titans. To a certain Titan named Prometheus, who was remarkably wise, was given the work of creating mankind. He fashioned the new race in a nobler shape than the animals, upright like the gods. And then he sought to furnish these helpless creatures with the means to live and thrive. Prometheus loved these new beings, these humans fashioned by his own hands. He saw their potential, their capacity for greatness, but also recognized their vulnerability. Unlike the animals who were equipped with fur, feathers, scales, swift legs, wings, or fins, humans stood naked and defenseless against the elements and predators alike. They needed special gifts to survive in this harsh world. In those days, Zeus, who had overthrown his father Cronus and the other Titans, reigned supreme as king of gods and men. Zeus had little interest in the welfare of mortals. Indeed, he had considered destroying them entirely. But Prometheus intervened, determined to ensure humanity's survival. First, Prometheus taught humans the use of their own minds. He showed them how to build shelters against the cold, how to read the seasons by observing the stars, how to tame animals to work alongside them, and how to cultivate the earth for food. He taught them numbers and letters, the mixing of medicines from healing herbs, the art of working metals, and all manner of skills and crafts. Yet one crucial element was missing: fire. Without fire, humans remained at the mercy of darkness and cold. They ate their food raw and shivered through the night. Zeus had deliberately withheld fire from mortals, keeping this divine power for the gods alone. Prometheus saw the suffering of his creation and made a fateful decision. He would steal fire from the gods and give it to humankind. He approached the fiery chariot of Helios, the sun god, and lit a torch from its flames. Then, concealing this precious spark in a hollow fennel stalk, he carried it down to earth and presented it to awestruck mortals. "Take this gift," Prometheus told them. "Guard it well and feed it with fuel, for it contains the means of life and progress. With fire, you shall become masters of all arts and shall have comfort against the cold." The humans received this gift with wonder and gratitude. Soon, fires burned in every human dwelling. The night was no longer a time of helpless darkness, but glowed with the warm light of hearth fires. Cooked food made humans stronger. Forges blazed as metalsmiths created tools and weapons. Pottery kilns transformed clay into vessels for storing food and water. With fire, human civilization truly began to flourish. When Zeus looked down from Mount Olympus and saw the fires burning in human settlements, his anger was terrible to behold. Not only had Prometheus defied his authority by stealing divine fire, but humans were now elevated above their intended station. They possessed a power that Zeus had meant to keep from them. "Prometheus," Zeus thundered, "you have betrayed the gods and upset the order of the world. For this transgression, you shall endure punishment that fits your crime of excessive love for these ephemeral beings." Zeus ordered Hephaestus, the divine smith, to create a pair of unbreakable chains. Then he commanded his servants, force and violence, to seize Prometheus and carry him to the most remote part of the earth, the great mountain range called the Caucasus. There, they bound the Titan with the unbreakable chains to the side of a precipice so high that the earth beneath was scarcely visible. But this was not the extent of Zeus's vengeance. He sent an eagle, offspring of monsters Typhon and Echidna, to visit Prometheus each day. This eagle would tear at Prometheus's body and devour his liver. And because Prometheus was immortal, his liver would grow back each night, only to be devoured again the next day. This torment was designed to continue for eternity, or at least for 30,000 years. Despite his agony, Prometheus remained defiant. He knew something that Zeus did not, a secret about a future marriage that could lead to Zeus's downfall. Zeus sent Hermes, messenger of the gods, to extract this information, offering to end the punishment in exchange. But Prometheus refused to reveal his secret, preferring endless torture to submission. As for humanity, Zeus was not finished with his retribution. If Prometheus loved mortals so much, then Zeus would ensure they received a punishment of their own. He ordered Hephaestus to create a woman of surpassing beauty, the first woman whom they named Pandora, meaning all gifted. Each god bestowed upon her a gift: beauty from Aphrodite, musical skill from Apollo, curiosity from Hermes, and so on. When she was complete, Zeus sent Pandora to Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus. Despite warnings from his prescient brother to accept no gifts from Zeus, Epimetheus was captivated by Pandora's beauty and welcomed her as his wife. Pandora brought with her a large jar, often mistranslated as a box, which she was instructed never to open. But the gift of curiosity that Hermes had given her proved too powerful to resist. One day, when Epimetheus was absent, Pandora lifted the lid of the jar. Immediately, there flew out all the evils that plague humanity to this day: disease, old age, labor, insanity, vice, passion, and all manner of sufferings. Pandora hastily replaced the lid, but it was too late. Only one thing remained in the jar: hope, which Zeus had included as a cruel comfort that would prevent humans from seeking the release of death, despite their miseries. Thus, through the defiance of Prometheus and the vengeance of Zeus, humankind gained the blessing of fire and all the arts of civilization, but also inherited the countless hardships that make life a mixture of joy and sorrow. For untold ages, Prometheus endured his punishment, neither bending to Zeus's will nor revealing his secret. The sun scorched him by day, the cold froze him by night. The eagle came with terrible regularity to inflict its torture. Yet through it all, Prometheus took comfort in knowing that his gift to humanity had not been in vain. From his remote crag, he could see the distant fires of human settlements, and know that his beloved creation continued to thrive and advance. Eventually, the suffering of Prometheus would come to an end, though not for many generations. The great hero Heracles, during his 12 labors, would pass by the Caucasus Mountains, and, taking pity on the Titan, shoot down the eagle with his arrows and break the chains. By that time, Zeus's anger had cooled, and he permitted the liberation of Prometheus in exchange for the secret he held that any son born to the sea nymph Thetis would be greater than his father. With this knowledge, Zeus avoided marriage to Thetis, instead arranging her marriage to a mortal Perilous, from which union came the great hero Achilles. But that is another story from another time. The legacy of Prometheus, his compassion, his defiance of tyranny, and his gift of fire remains one of the most powerful tales from ancient Greece, a testament to the belief that knowledge and progress are worth any sacrifice. The trial of Psyche. Following the reunion of Cupid and Psyche and her transformation into an immortal through Jupiter's divine intervention, one might assume their story concluded in perfect happiness. However, before Psyche could fully claim her place among the gods, she faced a series of trials so demanding that they have become legendary examples of seemingly impossible tasks. When Psyche first surrendered herself to Venus, seeking reconciliation and the return of her beloved Cupid, the goddess of love was far from welcoming. Still burning with jealousy over the mortal girl who had stolen both her worship and her son's heart, Venus determined to prove Psyche unworthy through a series of increasingly difficult labors. "So," Venus said with cold disdain as Psyche knelt before her, "you wish to be my daughter-in-law. You believe yourself worthy of my divine son. We shall see. Complete the tasks I set before you, and perhaps I will consider your petition." For the first trial, Venus led Psyche to an enormous storehouse where countless seeds of every variety, wheat, barley, millet, poppy, chickpea, lentil, and bean, lay jumbled together in a hopeless mass. The pile reached nearly to the ceiling, a mountain of minuscule grains impossible to distinguish from one another. "By sunset," Venus commanded, You must sort these seeds into separate piles, each kind with its own kind. Not a single seed may be placed wrongly. With that, the goddess departed, leaving Psyche alone with the insurmountable task. Psyche stared at the mountain of seeds in despair. Even with 100 hands working for 100 days, she could not hope to complete this sorting. She sank to the floor, tears flowing freely as she contemplated her failure. But Psyche's plight had touched the heart of an unexpected ally. Cupid, though forbidden to help her directly, had inspired compassion in the smallest of creatures. A tiny ant, chancing upon the weeping girl, took pity on her. This ant called to its fellows, and soon a great army of industrious insects streamed into the storehouse. Column after column of ants marched in perfect formation, each taking a single seed and carrying it to its proper pile. Their collective effort accomplished what no human could. By sunset, every seed was sorted flawlessly, each variety in its own distinct mound. When Venus returned and found the task completed, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You had help," she accused. "No matter, tomorrow's challenge will not be so easily conquered." For the second trial, Venus pointed to a distant grove beside a rushing river. "In that meadow graze sheep with fleece of pure gold. Bring me a tuft of their wool by evening." Psyche set out immediately, but as she approached the river, she could see that these were no ordinary sheep. Massive and fierce, with razor-sharp horns and murderous red eyes, they charged at anything that moved, goring and trampling any creature unfortunate enough to enter their domain. Once again, Psyche sat down in despair. To approach the sheep meant certain death, yet to return empty-handed to Venus would mean losing Cupid forever. As she contemplated her impossible situation, a green reed on the riverbank began to sway, though no wind was blowing. Then, to Psyche's astonishment, the reed spoke. "Do not attempt to gather wool directly from the sheep. They are most dangerous in the heat of day. Wait until the sun begins to set, when they seek the cool shade of the grove. Then you will find tufts of their golden wool caught on brambles and thorns where they have passed." Grateful for this advice, Psyche waited patiently until the fierce sun began its descent. Just as the reed had promised, the sheep left the meadow and retreated to the shadowy grove. Carefully, Psyche gathered the gleaming golden tufts that clung to thorny bushes and branches, filling her pouch without confronting the deadly animals. Venus received the golden wool with poorly concealed disappointment. "Mere luck," she sniffed. "The third task will require more than good fortune." For this challenge, Venus presented Psyche with a crystal flask of intricate design. "Take this to the summit of that mountain," she said, indicating a peak so high its top was perpetually shrouded in clouds. "There you will find the source of the river Styx, which forms the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead. Fill this flask with the black water and bring it to me." The mountain Venus indicated was more terrible than any natural formation. Its sides were sheer, polished rock, slick with ice and offering no handholds. Venomous serpents slithered from crevices, and at the summit, where the waters of the Styx cascaded from an unknown source, fierce dragons guarded the approach, their eyes never closing in sleep. Psyche approached the base of the mountain and knew immediately that no mortal could scale its heights. Even if by some miracle she could climb to the summit, the dragons would devour her before she could collect a single drop of the sacred water. As she stood gazing hopelessly upward, a shadow passed overhead. Looking up, Psyche saw a magnificent eagle soaring on the thermal currents. This was no ordinary eagle, but the royal bird of Jupiter himself, who had been moved by the girl's determination and Cupid's distress. The eagle descended in a graceful spiral and plucked the crystal flask from Psyche's hands with its talons. With powerful wing beats, it ascended toward the summit, navigating between the treacherous crags. The great bird's divine association allowed it to approach the source of the Styx unmolested by the guardian dragons. Carefully dipping the flask into the black waters, the eagle filled it to the brim before returning to deposit it gently in Psyche's waiting hands. When Psyche presented the flask of Styx water to Venus, the goddess could barely contain her fury. 3 impossible tasks completed, yet the mortal girl still stood before her, unbroken and determined. "There is but one final task," Venus said, her voice dangerously soft. She handed Psyche a small box of black polished wood, sealed with intricate locks. "Take this box to the underworld itself. Present it to Proserpina, queen of that dark realm, and ask her to place in it a small portion of her beauty. The journey has tired me, and I need this to refresh myself before tonight's festivities on Olympus." Of all the trials, this was by far the most perilous. No living mortal could enter the underworld and return to tell of it. The journey itself would claim Psyche's life, which was precisely what Venus intended. Psyche understood that this task meant her death. In despair, she climbed to the top of a high tower, intending to throw herself down and end her suffering. But as she stood on the edge, a mysterious voice spoke from the very stones of the tower. "Do not despair, Psyche," it said. "There is a way to complete even this impossible task if you follow my instructions exactly." The voice, which belonged to the tower itself, gave Psyche precise directions. She must go to a particular mountain where a hidden cave formed the entrance to the underworld. She must take with her 2 coins for the ferryman Charon and 2 barley cakes soaked in honey for Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of the dead. Most importantly, she must remain focused on her task and not be distracted by the many sorrowful sights and pleading voices she would encounter. "The spirits of the dead will beg for your help," warned the tower. "An old man in the ferry will ask you to give him a hand. A weaver at her loom will ask you to assist with her threads. You must ignore them all, for they are traps set to make you release the coins or cakes from your hands. Without these, you will be trapped in the underworld forever." Armed with this knowledge and the necessary items, Psyche found the cave and descended into darkness. She paid Charon to ferry her across the river Styx, though she resisted the impulse to help an old man who struggled to climb into the boat. She passed Cerberus by throwing the honey cakes to his 3 heads, though she had to steel herself against the piteous cries of a spirit who begged for a morsel of food. Through fields where pale shades wandered aimlessly, past the judgment seats of the 3 dread judges of the dead, Psyche made her way to the palace of Pluto and Proserpina. There, she knelt respectfully before the queen of the underworld and presented Venus's request. Proserpina, perhaps sympathetic to Psyche's plight or amused by her courage, agreed readily. she took the box and retreated briefly to her private chambers, returning with the container sealed once more. "Take this to Venus," she said, "but heed my warning, do not open the box, no matter how curious you may become." Psyche thanked the queen and began the long journey back. She crossed the Styx once more, passed Cerberus again with her remaining honey cake, and finally saw daylight at the cave entrance. Throughout her ordeal, she had kept the box tightly closed as instructed. But as Psyche neared the surface world, a troubling thought occurred to her. The box supposedly contained divine beauty, powerful enough to refresh a goddess. If Psyche herself used just a tiny bit, might it not make her more beautiful for Cupid? After all she had endured, surely she deserved some small reward. Giving in to temptation, Psyche carefully opened the box. But instead of beauty, what Proserpina had placed inside was a sleep so profound it was akin to death itself. A clever response to Venus's thinly veiled attempt to trap Psyche in the underworld. The moment the box was opened, this magical sleep escaped and overwhelmed Psyche, who collapsed on the path, appearing lifeless to any who might pass by. And there, she might have remained forever, had not Cupid, recovered from his wound and unable to bear separation from his beloved any longer, gone searching for her. Finding her unconscious form, he swiftly gathered the sleep back into its box and woke Psyche with a gentle touch of one of his arrows. "Oh, Psyche," he said tenderly, "curiosity has nearly undone you again, but now I will take matters into my own hands." Cupid gathered Psyche in his arms and flew with her to Mount Olympus, where he appealed directly to Jupiter, king of the gods. Moved by the young god's sincere love and impressed by Psyche's extraordinary perseverance through Venus's impossible trials, Jupiter called an assembly of the gods. There, before the full divine council, Jupiter formally gave his blessing to the union of Cupid and Psyche. Even Venus was reconciled when Jupiter pointed out that, with Psyche made immortal and brought to Olympus, humans would return to properly worshipping the goddess of love rather than a mortal princess. To seal Psyche's immortality, Jupiter offered her a cup of ambrosia, the divine food of the gods. Upon drinking it, she was transformed, her beauty now truly divine and eternal. Her union with Cupid was celebrated with a magnificent feast attended by all the gods. In due time, Psyche gave birth to a daughter whom they named Volupta's Pleasure, the natural offspring of love and the soul. For that is what Psyche's name means in Greek, the soul. The trials of Psyche have resonated through the centuries as powerful metaphors for the human journey towards spiritual growth and self-knowledge. Each impossible task, overcome through divine assistance and her own perseverance, represents a stage in the soul's development. The final trial, the journey to the underworld and back, symbolizes the ultimate spiritual transformation, a death and rebirth that prepares the soul for union with divine love. In this ancient tale, we find timeless wisdom, that the path to true happiness often leads through seemingly insurmountable challenges. That help often comes from unexpected sources, and that sometimes our greatest obstacles arise not from the tasks themselves, but from our own curiosity and doubt. Yet with perseverance, courage, and a little divine assistance, even the most impossible trials can be overcome, leading to rewards greater than we could have imagined. Stories of the Trojan War. Few conflicts have captured the imagination of humanity quite like the Trojan War. This legendary struggle between the Greeks and the city of Troy has inspired countless works of art, literature, and drama across the millennia. Though embellished through centuries of storytelling, at its core lies historical truth. Archaeological evidence confirms that Troy was indeed a real city that suffered a catastrophic destruction around 1200 before the Common Era. The war's origins trace back to a divine wedding feast to which one goddess was deliberately not invited. When Peleus, a mortal hero, married the sea nymph Thetis, all the gods and goddesses were invited to celebrate, all except Eris, the goddess of discord. Angered by this slight, Eris appeared uninvited at the festivities and tossed into the gathering a golden apple inscribed with the words for the fairest. Immediately, 3 powerful goddesses claimed the prize: Hera, queen of the gods and wife of Zeus; Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Their dispute threatened to disrupt the wedding and divide the divine assembly, so Zeus wisely refused to judge between them. Instead, he appointed a seemingly insignificant mortal to make this dangerous decision, a handsome young shepherd named Paris, who was actually the unrecognized Prince of Troy. Raised away from the city due to a prophecy that he would cause its destruction, the 3 goddesses approached Paris on Mount Ida, where he tended his flocks. Each attempted to influence his decision with promises of gifts beyond mortal imagining. Hera offered political power dominion over all Asia. Athena promised victory in battle and unmatched wisdom. Aphrodite, however, tempted him with the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Paris awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, earning the eternal enmity of Hera and Athena, who would later work tirelessly for Troy's destruction. With Aphrodite's guidance, Paris abandoned his shepherd's life, reclaimed his position as Prince of Troy, and journeyed to Sparta. There, King Menelaus welcomed Paris as an honored guest, unwittingly entertaining the man who would soon destroy his household. While Menelaus was away attending his grandfather's funeral, Paris seduced Helen with considerable help from Aphrodite's divine powers and fled with her back to Troy, along with a substantial portion of Menelaus's treasure. When Menelaus returned to find his wife and wealth gone, his rage knew no bounds. He called upon his brother Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae, to help him reclaim Helen. Agamemnon saw an opportunity to extend Greek influence and perhaps capture the wealthy city of Troy. He invoked an oath that all of Helen's former suitors had sworn to defend the rights of whomever she married, and assembled the largest fleet Greece had ever seen. Commanders and kings from across the Greek world gathered their forces at Aulis, prepared to sail for Troy. Among them were the cunning Odysseus of Ithaca, who had tried to avoid the conflict by feigning madness until his ruse was uncovered, the mighty Ajax, of enormous size and strength, the aged and wise Nestor, And most significantly, Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, whose divine mother Thetis knew he was fated to die at Troy if he joined the expedition. But the assembled fleet could not depart. Contrary winds held the ships at Aulis, and the prophet Calchas revealed that Artemis was angry with Agamemnon. To appease the goddess and secure favorable winds, Agamemnon would have to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. With heavy heart or with cold ambition, depending on the version of the tale, Agamemnon lured his daughter to Aulis with the false promise that she would marry Achilles. Instead, she was brought to the altar for sacrifice. In some accounts, Artemis substituted a deer at the last moment and carried Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess. In others, the girl died beneath her father's knife, setting in motion a terrible cycle of vengeance that would eventually claim Agamemnon's life. With the winds now favorable, the massive Greek fleet, nearly 1,000 ships by Homer's count, sailed for Troy. Upon reaching the Trojan shore, the first warrior to leap onto the beach was Protesilaus, fulfilling a prophecy that the first Greek to touch Trojan soil would be the first to die. He was killed by Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors and eldest son of King Priam. The Greeks established a beachhead and besieged the city, but Troy's massive walls, said to have been built by the gods themselves, proved impregnable. The war settled into a long stalemate that would last 10 years. Unable to breach Troy's defenses, the Greeks resorted to raiding the surrounding towns and settlements allied with the Trojans. During one such raid, Agamemnon captured a young woman named Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo. When her father came to ransom her, Agamemnon refused arrogantly. The priest prayed to Apollo, who sent a devastating plague through the Greek camp. Finally, to end the suffering, Agamemnon agreed to return Chryseis, but in compensation, he demanded Briseis, a captive woman who had been awarded to Achilles. This insult drove Achilles to withdraw from the fighting, taking his loyal warriors, the Myrmidons, with him. He asked his mother Thetis to intercede with Zeus, requesting that the god grant success to the Trojans until the Greeks recognized how essential Achilles was to their cause. Zeus agreed, and the tide of battle turned dramatically against the Greeks. With Achilles absent, Hector led the Trojan forces in a massive counterattack that drove the Greeks back to their ships. The Trojans nearly succeeded in burning the Greek fleet, which would have stranded the invaders far from home. In desperation, Achilles' dear friend Patroclus begged to borrow Achilles' distinctive armor to rally the Greek troops. Achilles consented, but warned Patroclus not to pursue the Trojans back to their walls. Seeing the armor of Achilles on the battlefield, the Trojans fell back in disarray. Caught up in his success, Patroclus forgot Achilles' warning and pursued them to the very gates of Troy. There, Apollo intervened, stunning Patroclus and allowing a Trojan warrior to wound him. Hector then delivered the killing blow and stripped the famous armor from his body. When Achilles learned of Patroclus's death, his grief and rage were boundless. Reconciling with Agamemnon and receiving new armor crafted by the god Hephaestus himself, Achilles returned to battle with a single purpose to kill Hector, regardless of his own fate. The Trojans fled before his onslaught, all except Hector, who faced the vengeful Greek outside the walls of Troy. After a desperate combat, Achilles slew Hector and, in an act of unprecedented disrespect, tied the Trojan prince's body to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy for 12 days, refusing all ransom offers. Finally, guided by Hermes, the elderly King Priam made his way to Achilles' tent under cover of night. In one of the most moving scenes in the Iliad, Priam knelt and kissed the hands of the man who had killed his son, begging for Hector's body. Achilles, reminded of his own father whom he would never see again, relented and granted a 12-day truce for Hector's funeral rites. The Iliad ends with Hector's funeral, but the war continued. Achilles himself was killed shortly thereafter, shot through his vulnerable heel by an arrow guided by Apollo and loosed by Paris. The Greeks and Trojans fought bitterly over his body and armor. When the armor was awarded to Odysseus, rather than Ajax, the latter was driven mad with disappointment and committed suicide. As the war dragged into its 10th year with no end in sight, the Greeks resorted to trickery. Following Odysseus's plan, they constructed an enormous wooden horse and left it outside Troy's gates while appearing to sail away in defeat. The horse was hollow, containing a select force of Greek warriors, while the main army hid behind a nearby island. The Trojans, believing the horse to be a divine offering, debated whether to bring it into the city. The priest Laocoon warned against it, crying, "I fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts," and hurled his spear at the horse to demonstrate it was hollow. But when 2 enormous serpents emerged from the sea and devoured Laocoon and his sons, the Trojans interpreted this as divine punishment and decided to bring the horse within their walls. That night, while the Trojans celebrated their apparent victory, the hidden Greeks emerged from the horse, opened the city gates for their returning army, and put Troy to the sword. The city was burned, its men slaughtered, and its women and children taken as slaves. Only a few Trojans escaped, including Aeneas, who, according to Roman legend, would eventually found the lineage that would become Rome. The victorious Greeks, however, would find their homecomings far from triumphant. Many ships were lost in storms sent by angry gods. Odysseus would wander for 10 years before reaching Ithaca. Agamemnon returned home only to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover. The survivors found their kingdoms changed, their positions usurped, their families estranged. The Trojan War marked the end of the heroic age in Greek consciousness. The direct intervention of gods in human affairs became less common in subsequent generations. The grand alliance of Greek states prefigured the later sense of Hellenic identity that would distinguish Greeks from barbarians. And the tales of individual heroism, divine caprice, human suffering, and the ultimate futility of war would provide inspiration for storytellers, poets, and artists for thousands of years to come. The Wood Folk. Once upon a time, men and the earth shared a special friendship. They attentively listened to what the forests and waters might communicate. Their vision was sharp enough to perceive wonders in tranquil rural settings and in the living beings that had not yet learned fear. To this enlightened outer world, people brought their happiness and sorrow. And because they cherished the earth, she responded to them. It was not considered unusual that Pan himself occasionally brought home a shepherd's wandering lamb. It was not remarkable if, when someone broke tree branches, some beautiful life within cried out at the injury. Even today, the earth rejoices with us during springtime, and we mourn for her when the leaves depart. But in ancient times, there existed a closer connection, clearer communication between humans and all other creatures, Earth and the stars above her. From the life they shared together, these remarkable tales have been passed down to us. And whether they are recounted skillfully or poorly, they are simply too valuable to be lost to memory. The wood folk were those spirits and beings who inhabited the forests and wild places of ancient Greece. They were neither fully divine nor entirely mortal, but existed somewhere in between creatures of mystery who could interact with both gods and humans. Chief among them was Great Pan, the goat-footed god whose domain was the untamed wilderness. Pan, with his shaggy legs and horns sprouting from his head, roamed the mountains and forests of Arcadia. He was a master of the syrinx, or panpipes, which he fashioned himself from reeds. When he played his enchanting melodies, the very trees would sway and animals would gather to listen. Yet his music could also bring terror, the sudden, inexplicable fear that seizes travelers in lonely places is still called panic after him. The wood folk also included the dryads, those shy nymphs whose lives were bound to individual trees. Each dryad was born with her tree and would perish if it were cut down. They were beautiful maidens who could sometimes be glimpsed dancing in forest clearings by moonlight, their flowing hair adorned with leaves and flowers from their beloved trees. Then there were the playful satyrs, companions to Pan, with their goat legs and mischievous nature. They loved wine and revelry, often joining in the wild celebrations of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. The satyrs would chase nymphs through the woods, though the clever maidens usually eluded their grasp. The naiads were the nymphs of fresh water springs, rivers, and lakes. These beautiful spirits were said to bestow gifts of poetry and prophecy upon those they favored. Shepherds would leave small offerings by their springs, hoping for the naiads' blessing on their flocks. In those ancient days, humans understood that every part of nature had its own consciousness and spirit. They knew to approach the wild places with respect, to ask permission before cutting wood or drawing water. They recognized that they shared the world with these other beings, neither above nor below them in importance, but existing alongside them in a delicate balance. When travelers ventured through forests, they might leave small offerings at certain trees or springs, a piece of bread, a splash of wine, or a simple prayer. These gestures acknowledged the presence of the wood folk and asked for safe passage through their domain. Those who failed to show proper respect might find themselves hopelessly lost, led astray by mischievous spirits, or struck by sudden, inexplicable fear. The wood folk were not immortal like the Olympian gods, but they lived far longer than humans. A dryad might witness generations of a human family come and go, while her oak tree stood strong. This gave them a different perspective on time and human concerns. They watched the rise and fall of human settlements with the same patient observation that they gave to the changing of seasons. As time passed, and humans built more cities, cleared more forests, and turned their attention to the gods of civilization, the wood folk retreated deeper into the diminishing wild places. Their voices became harder to hear over the noise of human activity. Yet they never truly disappeared. They simply became more elusive, revealing themselves only to those who still knew how to listen and observe with the attentiveness of the ancients. Even in our modern world, there are those who claim to feel the presence of these ancient spirits when walking alone in old forests or sitting beside a bubbling spring. Perhaps the wood folk are still with us, watching and waiting for humans to remember how to be friends with the earth once more.